This is The Morning. I'm Steve Schmidt, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Katherine Stewart, the journalist and the author of the new book, Money, Lies, and God. Katherine, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
My first question that I have when you read this book, and I know you are incredibly smart, capable. There are a million things that you could write about, that you could devote your attention to. Manifestly, there are injustices all over the world. There are threats all over the world. But you have applied your very formidable intellect, your creative energy, your work to writing 3 books about a very specific subject. Why have you written 3 books about Christian nationalism?
I started writing on this topic 16 years ago when a fundamentalist Bible club installed itself in my daughter's public elementary school in Santa Barbara, California. And right from the start, it was very clear to me that this group was much more than it appeared to be. They called themselves Bible study from a non-denominational standpoint. They said they just wanted to help the kids, but they were inculcating very little children in their public schools with the idea that if they didn't they didn't believe in the right kind of right version of the Christian religion, if they didn't believe in Jesus, they were going to go to hell. And they were like deceiving these very little kids into thinking that their public elementary school endorsed a very reactionary form of the Christian faith. Public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of very young kids, especially. They think if it's happening in their public school, it must be what their public school wants them to believe. So I was really astonished to discover that these clubs were legal and constitutional in our public schools, given the constitutional principle of church-state separation. And I could see how divisive these clubs were. They were targeting kids who were too young to read and giving them candy or prizes for recruiting their peers to the club. So they were incredibly divisive. They were taking this formerly harmonious public school community where kids are learning to get along with kids who are different, have different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and they were teaching the kids to divide one another into the pure versus the impure. You're an insider, you're an outsider. And the kids would say, I know it must be true because they taught it to me in school.
Can I ask one quick question, not to derail you?
Yeah.
How many parents are we talking about that brought this into the school? And right, I mean, it doesn't just spontaneously combust. So it's a group of 2 people, 1 person, 3 people, 7 people. How does this present?
Well, the interesting thing is these clubs, they call them clubs, they're programs. They are run by a national program called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. It's the people who came to our school were not parents. They're from outside the community, and members of our community didn't want them, including the evangelical parents at our school, who offered them free and better space in the church literally next door to the school. Montecito Covenant Church is an absolutely beautiful church, and the Good News Club leaders declined. This all really kind of astonished me, and I thought, how is it legal and possible? I started researching the legal strategy.
I have one more predicate question as we get deeper into this, but I just want to ask, right? And so for all the people that are watching this that have had the experience of traveling a lot, you and I both travel a lot. There is that moment in the hotel room of modern society where you walk around thinking to yourself, where the fuck is the plug? Right? Where can I plug something in? Where do these people who are from outside the district, right, who are not parents, right? I imagine them holding a cord. Where are they plugging into? Where do they make first contact in the Santa Barbara school day? Is it at a principal level? Is it at a board level? How do they breach the frontier?
They send a letter with legal backing from groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Council, which says, essentially, you need to let us in or we're going to launch a lawsuit. And what I could see is that these legal advocacy groups were reframing the First Amendment, religious freedom, to count as nothing more than speech from a certain point of view. So these kinds of clubs had been excluded from public we're talking really little kids here. They'd been excluded from the public elementary schools for years because they're adult-led clubs, not student-led. It's not like the Fellowship for Christian Athletes, which happens at the high school level and is led by students ostensibly. We're talking really little kids. But they mounted a legal strategy to reframe the idea of religion as speech from a certain point of view, and then force these programs into thousands of public elementary schools nationwide. And once I recognized the legal strategy, the perversion of what I could see as not just the religion clauses of the First Amendment, but also the free speech clause of the First Amendment, and I recognized that the legal advocacy sphere of the religious right was putting into place over time these novel legal building blocks, bringing just the right cases to the right circuit courts to get this big win. I could see that they were aiming to destroy our democracy. It was as clear to me as day back 16 years ago. And I thought, wow, if they follow this strategy to its logical conclusion, they are really going to try to take down our democracy. I also started really digging into the ideas behind the organization, the Child Evangelism Fellowship. This is a group that was incredibly hostile to the institution of public education because public schools are rooted in the principles of equality and pluralism. They're supposed to neither affirm nor denigrate any particular religious viewpoint because they have to be comfortable and open for all families. And they were exploiting this public schools in order to eventually destroy public schools. I went to their national convention. That was one of the first things I did. And I heard speakers say things like, any education that's not rooted in our faith is, a consequence of evil. I also saw speakers who were basically talking about, they were very, very anti-pluralism, but they were also, young earth creationists. They were deeply, deeply fundamentalist. They talk about children as strategic machinery for taking back the culture. They said, one speaker said, if you want to change the direction of the cruise ship, you got to go after those kids. It's the most strategic age group we have. They spoke of our public schools as mission fields and our children as the harvest. And they also hated public education. They would say, kick down the doors of the public schools or knock down all doors and all barriers to those public K through 12. Take the gospel to this open mission field now. And so it was really clear to me. I looked into this organization. I looked into their linkages there, and I could see that they were really part of a deep organizational infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement. They weren't just aiming for a seat at the table. They weren't just aiming to, we just want our voices heard in the noisy form of American democracy. We just want to be treated like everyone else, which is what they said. They really wanted to take over. And I recognized that the hostility to public education ran so deep. I mean, Jerry Falwell laid the agenda out in 1979. He said, I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them. So this is a sort of long story about how I fell down into this world And my newest book, Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, really is a big picture look. My first book was really about the war on public education as part of a larger attack on modern constitutional democracy. My second book took a deeper look at the Christian nationalist movement and its infrastructure. And Money, Lies, and God is even, I would say, bigger level. I pay very close attention to the money people, the people funding this movement. There are billions of dollars, billions that have been invested over decades. Many billions to destroy democracy. I look at lies or disinformation, which is a huge piece of the story. Steve, you probably know what percentage of Americans have been completely separated from the facts and led to believe this sort of QAnon conspiracy and this idea that, anyone to the left of the MAGA agenda is a woke communist or whatever. And then, of course, God, because Christian nationalism, I would say, is the largest, most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement.
Before we get into the newest book, I want to keep at this foundational level as people think about this and we move deeper into a discussion about the grave danger that this philosophy presents. And I want to take people into decision making at a local school district where there's a lot of good intentioned people, including the lawyer with the school district. And I have a very specific, sometimes where I have, I'm anti-lawyer, believe me, where a letter comes in and a threat is made, and somebody's going to take the letter, the attorney, and they're going to bring it to an elected board, usually, superintendent, somebody with authority who has a tight budget. And 9 times out of 10, the answer will be, let them in, avoid the fight. Now, let's pretend in a world that I'm the superintendent and I get the letter. And my instructions to the attorney are absolutely not. I will litigate this to the Supreme Court of the United States. And so the First Amendment issue, freedom of religion, and the appreciation that, in the constellation of ideas in all of the history of the world, good ones to really bad ones, genius ones to crazy ones, the greatest idea in world history, maybe, and certainly no lower than top 3, is the separation of church and state. So, has anybody opposed on a legal basis the intrusion of these groups into a school district and been successful at keeping them out, using the First Amendment, saying, no way? Or has the legal regime completely now opened the gates to they're in the public school systems everywhere all at once suddenly?
The right-wing legal sphere has invested so much money in taking the courts. Somebody like Leonard Leo, who you're very familiar with, recognized years ago that he wasn't going to be able to get the policies he wanted to pass if it all went to public vote, because he wanted to impose his religious values and his, frankly, right-wing ideological values on American society. And a lot of these ideas are deeply unpopular. So he understood that if you can get the courts, you can get the country. And all theocracies do that, whether we're talking about Iran or if we're talking about certainly Russia. which I wouldn't, it's sort of it's more of a kleptocracy with theocratic features. But this is what sort of more theocratic regimes do, or autocratic regimes with theocratic features do. They take over the courts. And that's something the right-wing legal sphere started to do quite some time ago. They started investing in these organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Federalist Society, and the Liberty Council. And so the right-wing legal sphere got this big win, if we're speaking about this particular organization specifically, in 2001, where they ran the case on in a public school that went up to grade 12. And now all of a sudden they're applying it to public schools that go up to grade 5. So initially they ran it, and it's like very different. Kids, you're talking kids who are like 6 years old. They were targeting children literally who are too young to read, with books that have no words, just pictures and shapes. And kids who are in the high school level are very different developmentally. But, without getting to the weeds about this, you were talking about ideas. And this is, broadly speaking, and I could see it right away, that this is a movement that fundamentally doesn't believe in the idea of America. They have the idea that America is founded not on any principles, but on a specific religion and cultural heritage. They have the idea that America is on the brink of an apocalypse, owing to the rise of equality and pluralism, and what they call, the radical left, which is anyone remotely to the left of them who actually believes in democracy, which, by the way, includes a lot of Republicans and moderate Republicans. They have this idea that democracy itself won't solve their problems. It won't bring about the changes that they want. They won't be able to impose. They won't be able to impose their values with a true democracy. And so they say the rules don't really apply anymore. And that clears the way for this idea of putting their faith in a strongman, right? An authoritarian leader who puts himself above the law, who's going to seize the reins of power and scrap the rule of law in favor of an iron fist. And I could see right away that they have this idea of the government. It's not just separated from church and state is very important, but this idea of the government as representative of the people and respecting individual rights in a pluralistic society. They really have the sense that this kind of government isn't what they want. So they want to sort of smash it up and create something new on autocracy, which is an autocracy. And this was clear to me from the very beginning. At the time, of course, we're talking 2016. The big story in religion journalism was the rise of the so-called nuns. I remember, who was it? It was a George Bush speechwriter who said this is a movement that could fit into a phone booth. I mean, you have to be willfully ignorant to not recognize that they were developing a legal advocacy sphere, think tanks, networking organizations. They were investing in really sophisticated data initiatives. At the time, they were also investing in these pastor networks that I've described in my work, Money, Lies, and God. I talk about Watchmen on the Wall and Faith Wins, where they know very well if you can get the pastors, you can get a sector, you can get their voters. And they turn out their voters in disproportionate numbers. I mean, I looked it up this morning. I think white evangelicals count as something like 13% of the population. And of course, as we know, evangelicalism is diverse, and not all white evangelicals support this movement, but they do in really disproportionate numbers. And then, of course, the movement also draws on ultra-conservative Catholics and Pentecost segment of charismatics. But they know if they can get those churches to function as like partisan political cells, they can dominate in election cycles, especially in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote at all.
So I agree with you completely on every conceivable level, deeply, about the threat. I have a but I would like to discuss. I think it is really important. And I think at this moment, that what I'm going to talk about has to be discussed. It has to be confronted. Because if you look at the current situation, we are all together in some type of proverbial plane crash in the Alaskan wilderness, cut off from the world we knew, dealing now with the realities of an unrestrained, thuggish Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Secretary Little Marco and African children starving with American food aid on the shelves, as ignoble, as unchristian, as indecent a set of actions undertaken ever in our history. So, how did that happen? That 49.9% of the people, by one of the thinnest margins as a matter of historic reality in the last 120 years, elect Donald Trump to be the 47th president of the United States. And I can't help but wonder the implications of all of those people whose accumulation of arrogancies left the gates unlocked for the wolves to enter a sanctuary. And so when public education was expressed as a national security necessity in the 19th century, as a society, we have to have mandatory public education for every kid. It was an evolution really from the first mandates of American society as it spreads out of the Plymouth Bay colony, right? Out of those original pilgrims. And the edict is every village that has 50 families in it has to have a school. Not a lot of rules imposed about what's taught in the school, but there will be a school. And so we have across America this vast network of community colleges, universities, the finest in the world, right? Most intricate, decentralized educational system that's ever been in world history that spreads out over 250 years. And about 140 years ago, got to educate every kid. And there's a lot of resistance to this. A lot of American men and women, immigrants. I need that kid who's 16 not learning nonsense about math. We have to harvest the crop. And don't tell me what to do with my kid. And so the purpose of public education, as argued by its advocates at the dawn of its inception, was the purpose of doing this is to teach citizenship. Because the Republic requires educated people to be good citizens. Has the curriculum of America's public schools in the last 30 years taught a doctrine of faith in America's institutions, in America's ideas? Or has America's public education system taught a faith of skepticism that degrades those ideas and places them in a context completely through the prism of today's mores applied to a fallen world that has evolved from 200 years ago, where we judge like little Maoists with red books the sins of the geniuses who incepted the greatest idea in world history. and denounce them for their hypocrisies instead of studying them through the context of human frailty. Because I think the answer to that question explains how it is, maybe, why we have what we have sitting in the White House, and how it is, in the absence of faith in something, there was a seed planted that grew a poisonous tree in a garden of tolerance that held we're all created equal, that the purpose of life is the pursuit of happiness, and that the framework of guaranteeing all of this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which has great nobility of purpose and has been defended at the greatest cost, and that there's a mutuality of connection through these values everywhere all around the world, but that the engine of their power is the United States. And children, you live in a flawed country, but a great one. And the purpose of your life should not be to be a billionaire, but to play a role in the fabric of your nation to help perfect the union. Do you see anywhere in America where that has been anywhere a part of the civics education on a 40-year basis as this pestilence rose?
You know, I'm just one mom who has actually sent her kids to several different public schools, as some of them do a better job of civics education than others. But I think that the fact that so many Americans have been drawn into a fact-free world speaks to the fact that we need a more robust civics education. We need to be teaching children critical thinking. We need to help them understand the difference between fact and propaganda, because we've really come to a place where there are these incredible propaganda operations being funded, by the way, by incredibly rich people that are intended to separate Americans from the facts and draw them into this movement that is actually destroying our country. It's, just look at what's happening now. You know, it's tanking our economy. It's, we have an amoral, transparently amoral leader and his billionaire co-president who's rampaging through the government, promoting chaos and going after grandma's Social Security and Medicare. We have alienated our most dear friends. They've instigated needless trade wars with some of our closest friends, allied with a kleptocratic murderer whose country has an economy smaller than that of Canada. I mean, it's really unreal what's happening, and the fact that so many Americans have been drawn into this fact-free disinformation sphere and actually thought that Donald Trump was going to save us, and we're so eager to abandon democracy and embrace a more authoritarian form of leadership speaks to a lot, speaks not just to the education section, but it also speaks, by the way, Steve, and this is really the subject, or a lot of the subject of my current book. Over the past decades, we've had a vast concentration, upward concentration of wealth at the tippy top of the economic ladder. This has led a lot of Americans to feel rightfully resentful. You have a lot of Americans who feel like they're being left behind. A lot of Americans also, by the way, have sort of unexamined prejudices that can be tapped into, but it's not all prejudice. The resentments can be tapped into. And you have these operations that are saying, these are the folks who are responsible for your troubles. The wokies over here, the wokety wokes here, and the liberals over here, the woke communists. And then, that primes them to, accept a leader like Trump he ran on promises of vengeance, and he promises to punish these people's political enemies. And they think he's going to make America great again. And that's not just an education problem, it's also an equality problem, an economic inequality problem. It's, these days you got two parents, you got three jobs, and they still can't manage a life of dignity for their kids. This is a movement that promises to stand for the American family, and that's very appealing to a lot of people. But they're driving support for economic, for politicians whose economic policies are just going to make things even worse for them. We're going to see tax cuts for billionaires by stiffing the working people of our country. And this is just going to be a continuation of the politics that have led us to this sort of state of unreason that we're in right now.
We're going to talk about three tributaries of this with our time remaining: fraudulence, corruption, and lethal danger. So let's start with a totem of fraudulence. And I'm not going to play it now while we're here together, but we will edit it in. And I'm going to show White House faith advisor, Pastor Paula, former mistress of televangelist Benny Hinn, married to now a former member of the band Journey, speaking in tongues, talking about demons. She has an office in the West Wing of the White House. And so, talk about the performances, the fraudulencies of these grifters that have always existed in the American culture. Snake oil salesmen, revival ministers, this uniquely American amalgamation of 30 different strains of Protestantism and mysticisms on a new continent that in the 250th anniversary year of the American Revolution has, in this great stew, produced luminescent fraudulence. Epic, right? And so talk about that, Pastor Paula and her friends.
Pastor Paula White is a representative of the independent charismatic movement that has brought new energy to the larger Christian nationalist movement. These movements are both multiracial, by the way, and also transnational. And for many years, they were nowhere near the center of the traditional religious right. But the way I do a lot of my research is I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings, and I started to notice there were representatives of this movement, people like Lance Wallnau, who are being invited to gatherings like Ralph Reed's Faith and Road to Majority conference. The first time he showed up, I was frankly stunned. I was like, wow, what's Lance Wallnau doing here? Because it was so unusual. And then all of a sudden they're having not just breakout sessions on what they call the Seven Mountains Mandate, which is the idea very common in these movements that people who dominate, that only Christians like them should dominate, or conservative Christians, or as they call it, radical, really, it's not conservative, should dominate the seven mountains or molders or peaks of culture, including finance, government, education, arts and entertainment, etc. And then they're having not just breakout sessions, but presentations on seven mountains from the main stage. So the ideas, the style and language of this sort of sector has spilled out into other sectors of the movement. It's a radically democratic idea, this idea of the Seven Mountains. This is a movement that often sees spiritual battles playing out in real time in the political realm. And they say that, God has, put his hand on Donald Trump's shoulder, and any opposition to him is demonic or satanic. There's a lot of demon talks, a lot of talk about taking dominion back from Satan. Anything that's not any sector of culture, any sort of position of power that's not dominated by someone like them is basically, a satanic stronghold. So it really
So
is
there is no room for disagreement.
no, and so it really provides
You are either with the man that God has said, you get to live today in Butler, Pennsylvania to save America and usher in the golden age while we kill the guy behind you.
well, it creates a permission structure for political violence, and there are a lot of representatives of this movement that were actually involved in organizing the sort of January 6th disgraceful attack on our capital.
Does the Secretary of Defense have any identifying markers or tattoos on his body that would associate himself with any aspect of this political movement that we're talking about?
Pete Hegseth appears to be more closely aligned with a pastor based in Moscow, Idaho, who has when I say he's a pastor, I mean he's another one of these, I would say, religious entrepreneurs who has like a whole world around him, publishing houses. He's the head of sort of parachurch networks. So there are a lot of churches that are kind of affiliated with his movement. His name is Doug Wilson. He is also equally anti-democratic. He has said that giving women the right to vote was a mistake. Think about that. And that's half the population, And he's extremely reactionary. He has published work that offers what has been widely perceived as a defense of what he calls biblical slavery. I have a lot of the details of that, I believe, in my former book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, where I have a section on Doug Wilson. And we know that Pete Hegseth has praised Doug Wilson, and he has also attended a church that is affiliated with Doug Wilson's broader ministry. So, it's interesting. There are multiple strains within this movement. The movement would, by the way, be nowhere without the influence of a cadre of ultra-conservative Catholics. But here's the thing, Steve. When you look at the people funding the movement, some of them are evangelical, some of them are Protestants, some of them are trad Catholics, some of them are Jewish, some of them are frankly atheistic. And, religiously, they're all over the place. But what they really want is economic policies that are going to justify their vast concentrations of wealth and actually increase it. They want minimal regulation for their businesses. They say it's so ironic. They say, we're just pro-capitalist. We want to let the markets do their thing. And yet they want taxpayer subsidies, a lot of them for their businesses. They want protective contracts, protective policies for their, I would say, privileged contracts, protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. Look at Elon Musk. You think he's motivated remotely by religion in any of this? Of course not. Or Barry Seid, the Chicago billionaire, who is not even a Christian, but he donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust. That's billion with a B. And he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. I really dig into the funders of this movement because I think it says something about the movement that's really important to remember. A lot of the religion stuff is just like, it just gets the rank and file on board, the foot soldiers. How are you going to get some poor lady living, I met so many of these poor women, single mother in Las Vegas who has had a bad divorce and one of her kids won't talk to her. Like, she's struggling to make it work as a hairdresser. I'm just thinking very specifically about someone I actually met. How are you going to get her to vote for economic policies that are going to hurt her, for a movement that actually wants to take away her right to vote, that's taking away her, or the form of birth control that she relies on, that is going to destroy the public school where her kids actually get, federally mandated services because one of her kids has a learning disability. Well, you get her all in on, blaming abortion and the trans people for all of her problems. You get her distracted by what I think of as like a laser pointer cat toy. You get her involved in a church where her pastor tells her, you got to vote your biblical values. And these are what your biblical values were, reduced to. And that's how you get her on board. And that kind of story is playing out over and over again in our country.
Okay. So again, for everybody that listens to this conversation, the political point that I want to make is this, and it is urgent in this moment in our country's history. Politics demand a response to this. If there is a vacuum of nothingness, there is no better faith. This disease can take root. So let's talk about the corruption quickly before we get to the end, which is the death, which is always what fills the theater seats. So the corruption of this, the connection points, the shared ideology is antithetical to Christ's message in that this manifests itself as a philosophy of taking, not love, not service. So if all of these people were lined up in the temple when Christ comes back, if he's the same guy as he was on the first go around, he will turn over their companies and tables. And so, how do these people live? Do they live as humble servants of Jesus Christ? Do they live lives of love and decency and compassion? Do they help the stranger? Blessed be the poor. Do they serve the cause that's outlined in the Sermon on the Mount? How do they live?
Great question. Google Betsy DeVos's yachts with an S, and you'll see. I mean, when you talk about the Sermon on the Mount and the social gospel, I was at America Fest recently in December. 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters and the head of Turning Point USA Faith. This is a gathering organized every year by Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA. The head of the faith outreach arm said that woke Christianity is heretical. He called progressive Christianity heretical, and he specifically spotlighted the social gospel as being part of this heresy. So it's really, he said, we need a new Nicene Creed and Council, referring to the, 4th century synod that sort of established that, he said, I've made it my mission to eradicate wokeism from the American pulpit. Wokeism, the social gospel, which is, as you know, what a lot of Christians think of as the gospel, the idea of loving your neighbor. But this is a movement that
I don't think, though, that's what wokeism is. I'm going to tell you what I think wokeism is. Have you ever seen the movie, Other People's Lives in East Germany, about life in East Germany?
I have not.
I think there's a difference by degree of different authoritarian systems. And when we grew up in an era where the authoritarian system that we faced was gray and drab and lifeless. The Nazis were utterly decadent and fascist. Trump's capital. It's a wild place. And no doubt snorting lines of coke off the bar. The Reich was a wild time. Wokeism is, in the eyes of a lot of men in the country, for example, and you look at their deterioration, again, the gates being open. You live in terror that you're going to be summoned to your HR department because you said the word whiteboard, or you were dined out by some millennial or some Gen Zer because you looked at them the wrong way or your privilege and all of that. That's where they went to. Now, I urge you to watch that movie, Catherine, right? Other people's lives, which show a different type of authoritarianism that's imposed by secular intolerance, language police, right? Hey, I'm for police reform. No, I'll destroy your police, right? Unless it's defund the police or
That's not,
or on all of these things. So
I
this
have
is,
to interrupt you for a second.
yeah.
Let me be clear. I don't think I count as especially woke. I'm pretty protective of the rights and dignity that women have had to fight for over centuries. I'm a big believer in Martin Luther King's statement that people should be judged on the basis of, not on the basis of their skin color, but by the content of their character. And
Because you're tolerant.
right, I'm inclined to think that identity politics has gotten out of hand, but even more so, not just on the left, but especially on the embittered right. But that said, right now, I'm much more anti-woke than I am anti-woke. And it's partly because the anti-woke movement has now become its own kind of wokery. I don't think we have time to mess around with battles that are often entered into for their symbolism,
Well,
for virtue's sake,
listen,
as opposed to actual harms and lives that are at stake. So I think the main purpose of a lot of this anti-wokery that we are hearing from the right is scapegoating. It's scapegoating to mobilize
yes.
an authoritarian movement. I mean, we're
Okay.
facing this huge crisis. Our democracy is under direct attack from within. We no longer have a credible system of justice and law enforcement at the federal level. Our economy and livelihoods are at stake. We have, millions of people likely to lose their Medicaid coverage and possibly their Social Security. And when you go to a place like Turning Point USA, all they talk, I would say every other speaker, when you go to that sort of America Fest, which I attended, they're like, massive signs everywhere. Give Trump his cabinet picks. Every other speaker spoke about this issue of trans women in sports. Whatever you think about that issue, they're using this kind of identity politics in order to mobilize for fascism.
Yes or no question. Mistake for Gavin Newsom to sit down with Charlie?
You know what? I haven't watched the whole thing, so I can't make a judgment
Okay.
until I watch the whole thing.
Last thing. We have 2 minutes left, but we don't really have to spend a lot of time on the last thing. So I just want to say, and I want to be clear about what I'm saying, which is this: the extremism of the left is the fuel of the grievance and the unjustified paranoia of the right.
It's part of the fuel, and I do have a section on that in my book, Money, Lies, and God.
It's truly the only renewable energy source known to man that never ends. And so we have to recognize it, because in the end, what Katherine Stewart is talking about in Money, Lies, and God, which I urge you all to read, is that this is a political faith, a dogma, and a philosophy that says something very different than the American faith, which is that God has given the individual human being inalienable rights, replacing it with a notion that God has mandated that we will enforce his will as we interpret it by exercising absolute political power to impose that interpretation on you, the human being, under our jackboot, enslaving you. And it is the singularly most evil political philosophy, short of Nazism, that has ever existed on earth. And everywhere it exists, there is suffering and there is death. And that is the point of this book. So I want to ask you, talk about the death. Because in the end, society is built on a few men, and it is always men who say, I am the voice of God, ends in blood. The question is, talk about where this inevitably goes.
Where it goes. Listen, I think
it goes into rivers of blood. That's where it ends.
Well, I think that we're not there yet. We have elections. As you said, look, Trump, the country didn't go MAGA. What happened is a lot of Democrats didn't show up to vote. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And we could do a whole other segment on that. We won't get into it right now. But one thing this movement does right is they give people a sense of identity. You know, it's not a nice identity, but it's an identity. And they also turn out their base to vote. All of that infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement is aimed at turning out their base. And they also go after low propensity voters. I think a lot of mistakes were made in this past election. And we need to, those of us who believe in a pro-democracy movement and its basic principles need to really focus on getting the vote out. We have elections in less than 2 years. I mean, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. Number one, we need a big tent. We're not going to agree on everything. We have to stop purity testing one another. But if we can agree on certain fundamental democratic principles, we can work together. Second of all, we need to really focus on turning out our base. I think relational organizing is much more effective than TV ads. There was so much money spent by the Democratic Party on the Democratic side on television ads, whereas on the right, they really invest in relational organizing.
Well, the difference between the television ads on the two sides was the MAGA ads were effective and the Democratic ads were crap, right? They were incompetently done. They had no emotional resonance. The urgency of the moment was met with Brat Summer in the politics of joy. And the Democratic Party gaslit the American people about a senile 82-year-old man who could not function and said he was good for 4 more years when the most menacing threat this country's faced since the Confederacy was bearing down. That's what happened. The Democrats lost an election on honesty on the economy, honesty on the border, and honesty about Joe Biden. And so now we deal with a lethal threat at hand. And the resolution to all of this, I think, is to really appreciate the fact that democracy is a misunderstood concept in the tone in which we argue it. And there was a Times of London editorial at the outbreak of the Civil War in explaining the difference in American society between the two propositions at hand, said the South is for democracy and it is for slavery. The North is for democracy and it is for freedom. So when the offering of democracy is put before you, American people, appreciate that what's at hand and what's at stake is your liberty. That's the consequence of the choice that democracy affords you. And liberty and democracy are different things. And so is faith, and so is politics, and so is God, and so is a tyrant. And so if you read this book, put up here on the screen, that's how you order it. Money Lies in God. Katherine Stewart, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning. I invite you to join this community where I promise to be honest, blunt, and direct about what is happening in this country. America is in crisis. Follow and subscribe to this channel on YouTube and on Substack. Thank you.